Hey, 421 class, we are in chapter 12, part 4. So we've been focusing our attention so far on employer discrimination, where firms choose to devalue certain individuals, and they're the ones who are being prejudiced and discriminated against, and choose the more expensive group that they're not discriminating against. Obviously, in terms of profits, you are willing to pay a price. This is a utility issue. It's not a profit maximization, because you would hire whatever is the less expensive input for a given level of marginal productivity. So let's talk briefly about a few other examples of discrimination, sources of discrimination, and hopefully we will segue pretty quickly to the questions that I assigned at the end of chapter 12. Okay, next on our list is customer discrimination. So customer discrimination is exactly what the name implies. This is discrimination that would take place by the people buying the product. So, for example, if you have, I'll give you a real example, baseball. If you look at the different cities in the 1940s, 1950s that had baseball teams, one was more segregated than any other, and that was Boston. So even though the Brooklyn Dodgers signed Jackie Robinson back in 1947, the Boston Red Sox did not sign their first African-American player until 1959. And Boston was not a very successful team in the 50s, most of the 60s, and the late 40s. Indeed, they did not win the league pennant between 1946 and 1967. So why would they do this? If it's coming from the fans, and the fans would rather see players of a certain skin color as the driving force, rather than the performance of the team, then you see this discriminatory behavior take place. Now, you might ask, why Boston? Doesn't Boston have a lot of minorities? Yes, it does have a lot of minorities. But I was working on a research project back in the 1980s, and we were able to pull some data that dealt with various cities in Major League Baseball, and Boston is the one that had the most segregated distribution of population. So even though they had a fairly large minority population, more people would have to move in Boston to integrate the city equally than any other city in professional sports. And I can tell you from my own observations, growing up and watching the Boston Celtics play when they were the top team in the league year after year after year, that they had an unusually large number of white players on the team. And that's exactly consistent with the notion of customer discrimination. And indeed, on page 471 of your textbook, there's a reference to a study that takes a look at TV viewership of the NBA, and ratings rose, all else equal, so correcting for other factors, when there was a greater participation by white players. Okay? So until we get to the point that that we're simply looking at performance, and performance is the only thing that really motivates attendance and viewership, then these other things come into play. Okay. And again, people are willing to pay a price for it because they can put up with a team that's more in line with their preferences. Okay, that's customer discrimination. How about employee discrimination? Employee discrimination would occur when certain people don't want to work with people who are different than them. So if an employer would have to pay a premium to hire people to work with people who are different from them, why in the world would they do it? They wouldn't. And indeed, again, if people want to, because it's a utility-based argument, it's not an income-based argument. If people's prejudice are such that they are willing to avoid working with certain people, even at the cost of their salary, then they will pursue that one way or the other. Indeed, a study finds that white males earn more in racially integrated workplaces. So you can see the pattern for the most part, and that is, and the customer discrimination is the tough one. Again, what is motivating people to want to buy a product, follow a team, things of that nature. But for other sources of discrimination, there's a strong argument not to, if the bottom line matters, okay? Then we can talk about statistical discrimination. This is simply seeing if hiring or promotional decisions are based on things other than characteristics that reflect differences in productivity. So when we have been called on to consult in cases where there's an allegation of discrimination, you can't prove discrimination, but you can show statistically that things don't appear to be random in terms of who's chosen for promotion and things of that nature. And there's a big literature and a lot of litigation and legislation that has tried to deal with that issue. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. But I want to talk about another one because it relates to one of the questions at the end of the chapter. And that is the concept of crowding, okay? So crowding is a situation where you're not discriminating in terms of what the pay is for a given occupation, but the discrimination occurs in terms of what occupations you're allowed to go into, okay? So for example, if minorities are precluded from a lot of occupations, that automatically pushes up the supply curve of those individuals in the occupations they're allowed to work in. And therefore, supply curve is going to shift to the right, and wages are going to be depressed. Even though everyone in that particular field are getting paid fairly, there's no distinction between the discriminated group and the non-discriminated group, but because they have to flood into that occupation, they will be worse off as a result. Like I said, we have a question at the end of the chapter that's going to deal with that. There's an interesting story, but it's an awful story, involving the first American to ever win the Nobel Prize in economics, okay? And that was Robert Samuelson. No, I said Robert, that was his son. It was Paul Samuelson, really famous. His dissertation became a book, basically a mathematical exposition of microeconomics. Very difficult to understand, written at a really high level. He was so smart, in fact, that when he got his PhD at Harvard, his dissertation committee, made up of a lot of famous economists, after the defense of his dissertation, supposedly they met amongst themselves and said, well, how did we do, rather than how did he do? So he was brilliant, absolutely brilliant economist, but Harvard would not hire him because they did not hire people who were Jewish back in the 1940s. And so he took a job at MIT. And years later, Harvard changed their policy and wanted to hire him. And he gave him the proverbial gesture that politely declined the offer. And in fact, he spent his entire academic career at MIT. So who got the last laugh on that? And again, it is feeding into utility arguments, but did Harvard have the best quality faculty that they could have had? Of course they did not at all. Okay, so what has the government done to reduce discrimination? Well, discriminatory behavior has been outlawed, or the government has encouraged consideration on the basis of gender and race. That's what affirmative action is all about. The activity to reduce discrimination, a lot of it is associated with when President Johnson was in office, but some of that actually predates him, can be traced back to President Kennedy. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 eliminated restrictions on women's work and separate pay scales for men and women, okay? Hard to believe there was a time when women were presumed to not be allowed to do certain kinds of jobs simply because of gender. And we know some of those barriers, particularly in more physical occupations, has come down more recently, but this was a whole host of occupations where there were differences in pay that were condoned in the day. The Civil Rights Act, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, allowed for class action lawsuits. To this day, because I've been involved in some of them, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is housed in Washington, D.C., will file lawsuits on behalf of employees or sometimes individuals who believe that the patterns and practice of the employer are discriminatory. And then, of course, it's then it becomes a statistical fight as to whether or not race was a determining factor in decisions that are made. And if so, then not only might there be monetary damages because people were not promoted to a manager position, let's say at a retail store or something like that, but there'll also be the requirement of a change in the practices are mandated as well, okay? Couple other terms, if you ever deal with this issue that you may want to be familiar with, are disparate treatment and disparate impact. Disparate treatment, it's kind of what the word implies. You're treating people differently, and that's a matter where you're showing intent, okay? So you are purposely hiring people in an underrepresented way vis-a-vis the population, vis-a-vis the qualified population, whatever is the metric that you're looking at. Disparate impact has nothing to do with the treatment of a firm. This becomes a lot more subtle because here we're looking at the result, not the motivation. And so the question here becomes, how close does the workforce mirror the community, the labor pool, the applicant pool? So if an employer has very few applicants from a certain protected group, that becomes a legal argument that, look, people simply didn't apply for the job. But on the other hand, as I explained a couple minutes ago with regards to affirmative action, you oftentimes take steps to try and outreach to increase the diversity of the applicant pool. So let me finish part 4 here with a real quick story. When I was a professor in upstate New York, we had some women on the faculty. We had no minority members. We had no African American economists in our department, and we were hiring. And the school had us reach out specifically and place ads, not only in the normal places that you would advertise for position, like job openings for economists, but we actually placed ads in the New York City newspaper that focused on issues relating to the African American community to try and get people to apply for the positions we had open. We didn't get any, as it turned out, but we certainly made attempts to try and diversify. Okay, and it becomes a pretty complicated issue. And beware, sometimes things that seem to be kind of obvious, once you actually correct for non-discriminatory factors, the impact may be a lot less. Okay, part 5, we'll do the questions at the end of the chapter.